Hey everybody, welcome to episode 147 of Fight Chat Friday. So today is an interesting one. We're going to go 20 years back in time and compare a very similar weight division. They're a little bit different now. We have 69 kilo in 2023 and 20 years ago, 2003 World Championships in Poland. We're looking at the 71 division. So we're going to compare them, see what's different, see what's changed and why have all these things changed. So this is going to be an interesting one, and we hope to do a couple of these type of videos and look at different fighters and see how the stats compare. So we have the stats done as well on this, which will be interesting to see, and we can see what has changed and the reasons behind it. So this is going to be a good one. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Yeah, let's just start back 20 years ago. The year is 2003, and we have on the right hand side, you can't exactly tell from a helmet, which is one of the immediate
Yeah,
ones.
yeah.
That's David Kerr from Brazil on the left hand side, Neil Ernest from Wales in blue, and
Both fighters we've had on the show recently as well to talk about their experience down through the years.
absolutely, certainly legends of their time. David Kerr, three-time world champion, um, and this was Neil's fight. so
Yeah.
uh, this was the big one for Neil. So
So
starting
first
off,
thing that we can see, Adrian, as well as the ring is much bigger, isn't it?
yeah, we're in the 9 meter ring era at this stage. So in the green mass, we're seeing 7 meters. That red mat around brings it to 9. So that is a massive amount of extra real estate in the ring.
Yeah, another thing we see right off the bat is a lot of stance switches and steps happening as well, which we do see a little bit of testing going on in the modern game, but not like this because the distance is just that little bit further out. So I don't think you get as much respect from your stance switches and steps.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting for me here how Neil does using that longer distance does let you bring the back leg into it, and that gives you a way to change back to your preferred side.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the idea of changing your stance or trying to draw something out of your opponent at more than a match distance, it's just a little less likely, I think, now. I mean, most people would feel fairly safe once you're that mat away. But then we have this stepping through with the jumping punches, and I think that is definitely a signature of not just this time, but slightly before it as well. And I mean, we were chatting just before we started. I'm not actually sure when it changed from being worth 2 points for a jumping punch to being worth 1 point, but it's around this time. And we see David Kerr looking to come back with them as well. I think that's something that both fighters still have, part of their game from the previous era of
Yeah.
sparring as well.
Yeah, of course. And the thing as well is they almost use it like we use a blitz now.
Mm.
And that's how they enter into contact. But you're open for a big back kick or a defensive side kick there. If you get that wrong as well, you're literally jumping into the open space.
Yeah, it's a lot more height than what we'd be expecting now of a direct entry to hands. So call it blitz,
Yeah.
call it whatever you like. We wouldn't be expecting a person to get up just because it takes that much longer. You cover less space, less horizontal space between you and your opponent. That you can start to see it hybridizing there a little bit with Niels. This stays a little
Mhm.
bit lower. It's still very much a jump, but it stays quite a bit lower to the ground than some of the earlier ones.
Yeah, and we do see as well that like bit of context here. Both of these guys traditionally, I suppose, they would have been more counter fighters, so I think that does impact the volume as well. They're looking for the counters and the cleaner shots a bit more. But that was the way for a lot of these guys. You either have people who are looking to bring the fight to you and literally have a good scrap, or people who are very clever and look for very clean clinical scores. And
Mm.
both of these guys would be the latter, I think.
Yeah, I mean, also if we look at the combination of the stances, so from Neil's stance, it's not immediately obvious that he's going to be leading with that side kick, but he does it so effectively, particularly a very very quick shortening step, and he can explode over quite a distance with it. But for David Kerr, we would be expecting from his stance that he'd be making much more use of that front leg for the side kick or to threaten with the legs. But he does throw the turning kick off it when the facing suits.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not too keen to attack with the front leg that way. He's just looking to close the distance, get in close, and bring the hands into play or the counter turning kick.
And that is very hard in that bigger ring because you look at the gap there between the two fighters, especially when the other person may be winning. Now, we don't have live scoreboards back then in 2003, but you have an idea if you're ahead or if you're not ahead. And here we do see that it's difficult for you to close the distance. A bit easier for Neil because he has that front leg that he can use to flick and carry and use it to close the distance. But on the flip side, then if you don't have that front leg sidekick like David Kerr, you have to rely a little bit more on your countering, and that all works well if you're leading. But if you're not, it's a bit trickier.
in watching this match and others like it, there seems to be, if we look back at the way that the guys fought, I don't think that the discipline around the ring space and the control was as much of a thing as you see now. And maybe
Absolutely.
that's because it was so much harder to push the person out or make them exit and develop that warning. Maybe there wasn't as much of a return on that kind of effort. But there again, it's also possible that just it wasn't seen because it wasn't always obvious on the scoreboard.
Yeah, that's it. When you don't have the live scoreboard actually flicking back
Oh,
and
there you
forth
go.
because of warnings,
Yeah.
there you go.
Well,
Yeah.
in the back left, we actually do have. I remember these ones, the old Polish electronic scoreboards. You could see the scores in those ones. So this would have been a
Oh, really?
rare thing. And I remember the Polish having, a number of rings, and they would like bring them over to Viking Cup as well. So that was a huge novelty for us, going
I
way
think this
back
just
then.
tracks warnings and time only, though. Yeah.
No, you could actually get
Does
the score in each corner. So it was a very
back in the
simple system.
Viking Cup maybe like 2007, 8, 9. Yeah, but I think this one here, I don't think it actually has it because we see
Mm,
not in this clip, but the referees actually hand up their piece of paper. So I don't think
okay,
it's actually
okay.
electronic.
So
Let's say.
at this point, it's only showing the score and the warnings.
Yeah, the time and the warnings, correct.
Okay, sorry, the
Um,
time and the warnings. Okay.
but yeah, for me, one of the big things from this fight, Neil was a bit ahead of his time, I think, with the front leg, and his big style there was really trying to use that to set up everything else. He had a wicked back kick as well that we didn't see too much of this fight,
Mm,
but overall, the volume overall a little bit lower, less continuation and flow from shot to shot. And I think that the respect of the distance as well was just a little bit greater where now we see people continuing getting into that distance more with the little bit more nuanced steps and disguise of rhythm, let's say. And because of that, then there's a bit more continuation on the mid range to closer range.
yeah, I think what you're seeing very often is because the initial distance is bigger, we're seeing bigger shots thrown from distance as well, like those
Mm.
big back leg turning kicks. The dramatic angle dolio that we saw from David Kerr in round two. Um, the stepping in side kick to carry, so because of course you need to cover this bigger distance, but you can probably get away with the step because you're starting so much further away. It's not like the person's
Hmm.
going to your opponent's going to jump your leg.
Yeah, don't have the
um
direct counter from that. Yeah,
yeah, but again, distance is agreed between you and your opponent as such. You
yeah,
have to fight for to control it. So if both people agree to spar at this longer distance, it brings out a whole range of shots, and we've seen that before. We watched a match between Hong and Neil as well at the UK Impact Open, and you can see an agreement to spar at this longer distance, and then you almost have to take a bigger chance. When you throw that back leg turning kick, or you step in and carry your side kick, or you go with that jumping punch entry, the other person has a little bit more time to see and pick a counterattack. So that longer distance with the bigger engagement, kind of like high risk engagements, it does make for some very interesting and exciting counterattacking play. But it also means that, coupled with the bigger ring, it can be very, very difficult to actually track the person down, hold them in a space, and pull scores out of them compared to what we're seeing now in the smaller ring.
yeah. I think so. Like for the modern game as well, because of that, a little bit more exciting and a little bit more action for people who are not interested in Taekwondo. For
Mm-hmm.
us, like either match here, we're going to be interested in because we
Yeah,
understand the game a little bit more, and everybody else who's watching this, of course. But for people outside of the sport, maybe like parents of juniors or supporters, boyfriends, girlfriends who come along to watch, whatever, it's a bit more exciting now because of all those things that you just mentioned.
yeah. So let's have a look at a slightly trimmed down version of one that we covered, I think, 4 or 5 weeks ago when we were looking at the European Championships, and it was between James Tuite and Timothy Boss. So we can have a look at, just by way of a quick contrast before we go to the stats, looking at a different style of sparring that we have currently, where I think you definitely see, particularly from Timmy, a real intention to close that space and keep pressure throughout the entire 4 minutes of the match.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a little bit more going on in terms of the footwork and the bouncing to set that little bit more intense rhythm. And we can see that then there's a lot more feinting and biting for that matter because the distance is closer as well, which allows for Timothy in this instance to squeeze towards the corner a bit more. which then on the flip side allows James to suck him into that space to try pull off bigger shots. So that's kind of one of the bigger big changes that we see so far because of that. And I think the ring position that little bit smaller makes for that to happen way more.
Yeah, I mean, we can also talk about maybe the difference in the range of shots from, particularly from the likes of James, where, we're not seeing a very, very wide range of shots on display. We're usually looking at the front leg side kick, turning kick, and hacks, and maybe hands reactively. But we're
Mm.
seeing them applied with a lot of variation in terms of the distance, the timing, that pull push. So they're not being applied in the same way each time. So even with a slightly more limited range of shots being thrown, we're seeing plenty of variety in the combinations of them, the setups of them, the depth of the carry, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the big things for me, you spoke of a non-verbal agreement in the first fight that we watched. I think here right now as well, there is a little bit of a difference that there is no real stop until somebody gets a very clear dominant position or the referee stops. And what
Mm.
I mean by that is in continuation. So once we have the initial entry shot, somebody is looking to really gain advantage here, like Timothy, for example. There's no verbal agreement. Okay, there was a shot there. Let's break off and reset again. Whereas I feel like that was the case in the first fight we watched 20 years ago. That
Mm.
once there's a little bit of an exchange, okay, maybe you got the better of that exchange. Let's restart and go again. But that doesn't really happen these days.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think there's a very conscious effort to micromanage your points and micromanage your scoring. So, in other words, people are starting to look at it as, okay, you got 2 points. We don't put a pause on that and add the 2 points to the scoreboard. We're like, okay, well, yeah, but can I get one back? Can I improve my ring position? Can I push you out for a warning? So can I minimize the impact of that score by putting you in a worse ring position, by stealing 1 point back off of you, or by forcing you to exit? And if I can do that, I'm negating your ability to build momentum, and that becomes
Yeah,
a
we see
huge
the
deal over time.
banging in the tree turning kicks from James is just
Yeah,
exemplifies that. But like I think for me as well, one of the big things is the when you see a nice clear shot in 2003, it's oh that was a nice shot because here there's so much action and so much speed that everything is in flow and we're into the next exchange, and there's so much happening. So like you have to be switched on way more, and I think it's just and you have to be switched on and have your focus in the whole 4 minutes, where there's a little bit of a more downtime 20 years ago, and I think because of that extra distance as well, that gives you that luxury.
yeah, and it does obviously speak to potentially different level of conditioning that's required because
Yeah.
the metabolic demand of the match is going to be just a little bit different as well. But I imagine you see that is something as well that, like, we're looking at this one division, we're comparing four athletes. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
we could say in the modern 69 kilo game, Timmy is definitely a higher pressure fighter, and James himself likes to play up tempo quite a bit as well. Even though he'll have more pulling, he doesn't create direct forward pressure as much as Timmy does. But that's a particular style. Whereas on Imagine, if we look at a different style of fighter from, as you said, Neil and David both being by preference maybe more counter fighters, they're willing to
Mhm.
pull a little bit and wait for opportunities. They're more patient. We can probably throw in one of the Slovenians, Thomas being the obvious example, maybe one of the Dutch, and you might get a more high tempo, match that clashes. Certainly, it's interesting because as we've looked back at Hong, who was sparring back then against the likes of these guys, um, and watch as things evolved over time. Like there was a lot more play at distance, but maybe less interactions, even for someone who likes to spar at a high tempo with lots of pressure.
Yeah, a bit more calculated now, I think, in his later stages. But back then, like as I said, for the likes of Neil picking off some really juicy shots, and David as well from time to time, like those are bigger highlights then in the match,
Yeah,
which I think stand out a bit more in terms of the scoreboard and for the referees in the corners as well. And here we see the match in 2003. We have a lot less volume. Warnings were actually well managed, which I was impressed with because I didn't think that would be the case without live
sure.
scoring. But now maybe the scoreboard being there for the time influenced that. The hands a little bit more engagement with general hands, but the jump punching obviously being a big factor there. Side kick, not a big factor for David Kerr, but that's I think particularly just his style.
Yeah,
And then on the
definitely.
flip side, I think Neil was actually a big user of that compared to everybody else at the time. So a bit of context for that, of course, as well. The Dalia Chagi, a big feature back then, and I think that has returned significantly in the last 2 years. We
Yeah.
haven't seen the Dalia Chagi being used as much, and we see it being used way more now, especially in continuation. And the front leg carry, I don't think it was as much of a big deal back then. Again, Neil Ernest was a little bit different back then, but overall, the front leg carry wasn't something that we've seen as much as we do now. And that all accumulates into, for me, a lot less volume overall. A lot that comes from less continuation, a less flow from shot to shot, and overall less volume because of the further distance as well.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at these 2 minutes, and I'll bring up the other stats in just a second, we can kind of see that other than Neil's front leg carry, David's dolio, Neil's side kick, and maybe a little bit, just beyond it with David's hands, we can see everything sits below the 5 attempts in over the 4 minutes. So, and overall, our most frequently used technique for each person, we've got 10 occasions, and as we bring up the next one, we'll see that it's basically doubled.
Which
So
is
that
crazy.
it's
Yeah.
quite a bit different. Quite a bit
It
different.
is. And then, of course, the warnings are impacted by that as well because more action creates more opportunities to fall, to lose balance, to step out of the ring, and for a little bit more messy play. So we see the warnings way higher there and on this one. A little bit more variety in shots in this particular fight, I think, as well. We see 360, band-aids, Tuite, all involved. The hacks, obviously, a massive shot for James, nearly hitting that
Yeah, for
25
sure.
mark. But as you said, overall, nearly every shot, even their less frequent shots, are pushing up towards where the 2003 fight were having their biggest weapon. So just shows the overall volume just a little bit more. And obviously, we went through the reasons for that earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, like we always have to learn from the past as well. So when you're looking at what the guys are doing 20 years ago, what's still relevant now? And I think there's something to be said for that in terms of like when we look at that play over distance, lengthening the distance can give you the opportunity to enter with different shots, and in particular when you're sparring somebody maybe who's a very good front leg, that they're quicker about getting the front leg up than you are, or if they're very good at getting over your front leg to hands, making that longer distance first so that gives you time to get your leg up and then carry into the space. That's something that we could take from what Neil was doing back then. Even that he didn't have to lift and carry as directly as in lift the front foot and carry, because at that longer distance he could afford to make a step in with the back leg, and it wasn't like Neil could interact with that or deal with that because the distance was too great. So I think that's again something quite interesting that we can steal as an idea or use as an idea there. And then when we're looking at how the punching worked and what it did, we can still see that same carry through to where, okay, we might stay lower and go more direct with the blitz now, but the drive through to hands affording you the opportunity to move your opponent and finish with the turning kick, very much a factor then as now.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right there with all those points as well. Another big factor is the whole idea of evolution. It's meant to get better as you go through the years, and I'm sure Neil and David will be the first to acknowledge that. I hope that the whole level of ITF across the board will be better in 2023. In 2043 than it is right now.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm sure Timothy and James will be happy to see that as well. And that's only natural, and that's the way it's meant to go. So, obviously, the guys at the time were outstanding, and like everything they did was really, really high level and legends of ITF. So, definitely not doubting their abilities or playing down anything they did, because very, very exceptional athletes of their time, multiple world champions. But ideally for everybody, things move on. And if they're not really, we're not really doing our job as coaches, as athletes, and everybody involved in this sport. So let's see what it's like in 2043. I don't know when me and you be here, Adrian, to do an analysis of that, but I'm sure somebody will be there at that time.
Someone will talk about it, and hopefully we still have the
Yeah,
videos to look back on. That'll be great.
that would be cool. Yeah. So yeah, if you enjoyed this one, guys, let us know something different. Maybe we can do some more of these from the 2003 World Championships, comparing them to this year. That would be cool if you're interested in some of those. We might do another one or two, and if there's any people in particular you would like to compare, let us know, and we'll get stuck into those. If not, we'll catch you in the next one.
See you now.